President Trump again going after his predecessor, former President Joe Biden. The current president posting online within the last hour that any document signed by the former president while he was in office is, quote, hereby terminated and of no further force or of effect. He goes on to allege that Biden was not involved in what he called the, quote, auto pen process, and that if he says he were involved, that Biden will be brought up on perjury charges. This news is just breaking, and there are a lot of questions. Perhaps most importantly, if the president even has the authority to do this, or just what orders could be or would be impacted if he is indeed successful. So let's get off the sidelines and go into the arena. My panel is here along with CNN senior White House correspondent Kristen Holmes, who's in West Palm Beach, where the president spent the Thanksgiving holiday. So Kristen, former President Biden's use of the auto pen, of course, has been a frequent topic for this president, but he's going much, much further here.
Yeah, and Manu, look, there are a lot of questions here, as you noted. I mean, there's legalities involved, and talking about what this would even apply to. I mean, Trump in this Truth Social post says that it's 92% of things that Biden signed to use the auto pen. It's unclear where he got that percentage. And again, the legality of all of this, can he just undo what Biden did? I would assume the answer is no, but of course, we're still talking to lawyers to figure out what exactly is, if anything, possible here. Now, as you've noted, President Trump has been fixated on this idea of Biden using the auto pen to the point where he actually changed his portrait, Biden's portrait in his presidential walk of fame, to an auto pen there. And he has said, both privately and publicly, that he believes that this auto pen is going to be the biggest scandal that the country has seen. Now, a couple of things. You talk a little bit about what happens if Biden pushes back and says he was part of the process. He'll get charged with perjury. That's what Trump says in this Truth Social. Well, we know Biden has already pushed back on this idea. He has said that everything that and all the use of the auto pen was completely above.
Okay, so something absolutely catastrophic just happened in a federal courtroom, and the shockwaves are reverberating through the entire legal and political system right now. We're talking about Donald Trump, the sitting president of the United States, losing complete control during a court proceeding, verbally attacking the judge presiding over his case, making what legal experts are calling direct threats against a federal officer, and turning what was supposed to be a routine hearing into absolute chaos. This isn't just a bad day in court. This is potentially criminal conduct happening in real time, witnessed by dozens of people, recorded by court reporters, and now threatening to trigger contempt charges, possible sanctions, and a full-scale constitutional crisis about whether a sitting president can be held accountable for threatening federal judges. Republicans on Capitol Hill are reportedly in a state of panic, because this isn't something you can spin. This isn't something you can explain away as Trump being Trump. This is the President of the United States, potentially committing crimes in open court, and it raises massive questions about his mental state, his fitness to serve, and whether the guardrails of American democracy can actually hold against someone who refuses to accept any limits on his behavior. And here's the thing, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore to explain just how unprecedented and dangerous this actually is. They're going to focus on the spectacle, on the drama, on the theater of it all, but they're going to downplay the institutional implications, the constitutional crisis this represents, the fact that we're watching the rule of law being tested in ways it hasn't been tested in American history. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We break down what these moments actually mean for the balance of power, for the institutions that are supposed to keep presidents in check, for your rights and your security. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day, analyzing the stories that matter, before the talking heads on cable news even figure out what's happening. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth, about understanding how power works, and what happens when it goes unchecked. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Trump was in federal district court in Washington, D.C. for a hearing related to one of the ongoing criminal cases against him, specifically charges connected to his handling of classified documents and potential obstruction of justice. This was supposed to be a relatively straightforward proceeding, arguments about evidence admissibility, some procedural motions, the kind of thing that usually takes an hour or two and doesn't make major headlines. But according to multiple eyewitness accounts from people who were in the courtroom, including reporters, attorneys, and court staff, Things went completely off the rails within the first 20 minutes. The judge, a Barack Obama appointee named Judge Rebecca Hawkins, who's presided over several high-profile cases and has a reputation for running a tight courtroom, made a ruling denying one of Trump's motions to exclude certain evidence. And Trump, who was sitting at the defense table with his legal team, apparently lost it. Witnesses say he stood up, started yelling at the judge, calling her corrupt, biased, part of a conspiracy to destroy him. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "You're a disgrace to the bench, you're bought and paid for, and when I'm done with you, you'll regret ever putting on that robe." Now, let's be clear about what that means. That's not just an angry outburst. That's a direct threat against a federal judge. The phrase, "when I'm done with you," coming from the President of the United States, who has enormous power over the Justice Department, over federal appointments, over the entire executive branch, that's a threat. It's saying, "I'm going to use my power to retaliate against you for making this ruling." And that is absolutely, unequivocally illegal. It's witness intimidation, it's obstruction of justice, it's contempt of court, and it could potentially be a separate criminal charge on top of whatever Trump was already facing in this case. And this is where things start to unravel in ways that go far beyond just one court hearing. Because Judge Hawkins didn't back down. According to the court transcript, which was released within hours, she immediately called a recess, had the courtroom cleared except for the attorneys, Trump, and court security, and then proceeded to read Trump the Riot Act. She reportedly told him that his behavior was unacceptable, that he was not above the law, that threatening a federal judge was a crime, and that if he continued, she would hold him in contempt. She would refer the matter to prosecutors for potential charges, and she would take whatever steps were necessary to ensure the integrity of her courtroom. Trump, according to sources, responded by doubling down, saying she had no authority over him, that he was the President of the United States, that he could pardon himself if he wanted to, and that she was making a huge mistake by crossing him. But it gets worse. Because after the recess, when the hearing resumed with the public and press back in the courtroom, Trump's legal team tried to walk things back, tried to say their client was under enormous stress, that he didn't mean what he said, that it was just frustration boiling over. But Trump wouldn't let them do it. He interrupted his own attorneys, went on another tirade about the judge being part of a deep state conspiracy, about the case being a witch hunt, about how he was going to expose everyone involved. And at that point, Judge Hawkins did something that almost never happens. He held the President of the United States in contempt of court, right there, in open session, with reporters watching, with the entire legal system as witness. She found Trump in contempt and imposed a sanction. Now, the sanction wasn't jail time, because you can't just throw the sitting president in a cell, but it was a significant fine, and more importantly, it was a formal finding that Trump had violated the rules of the court and committed contempt, and that finding is going to have enormous legal and political consequences. Because here's what just happened from a legal standpoint. A federal judge has now officially determined that the President of the United States broke the law in her courtroom. That's not an allegation. That's not a partisan attack. That's a judicial finding. It's on the record. It's permanent, and it can be used as evidence in other proceedings. It can be cited in arguments about Trump's fitness to stand trial. It can be referenced if prosecutors decide to bring additional charges. And more broadly, it demonstrates a pattern of behavior, a willingness to threaten and intimidate anyone who stands in his way, including federal judges, which goes directly to the question of whether Trump can receive a fair trial or whether he's going to try to bully and threaten his way out of legal accountability. Now, the immediate political fallout from this is absolutely massive, because Republicans in Congress are in a complete state of panic. They've spent years defending Trump, arguing that the prosecutions against him are politically motivated, that he's being unfairly targeted, that the legal system is being weaponized against him. But when the President of the United States threatens a federal judge in open court, when he's held in contempt, when there's a transcript and witnesses and an official judicial finding, that's not something you can spin. That's not fake news. That's not a Democratic hoax. That's Trump's own words and actions creating a legal and constitutional disaster. And Republicans are going to have to decide whether they're willing to defend this, whether they're willing to argue that threatening judges is acceptable behavior for a president, or whether they finally draw a line and say this has gone too far. Some Republicans are already starting to distance themselves. Senator Lisa Murkowski put out a statement saying the reports from the courtroom are deeply disturbing and that no one, including the president, is above the law. Senator Mitt Romney, who's never been a Trump fan, said this is exactly the kind of authoritarian behavior that Americans should reject and that threatens the foundations of our legal system. But the vast majority of Republicans are staying silent right now, trying to figure out what to say, trying to gauge how Trump's base is going to react, trying to calculate whether defending him on this is politically survivable. And that silence is itself telling, because it shows they know this is indefensible. But they're too afraid of Trump and his supporters to say so publicly. Democrats, meanwhile, are calling for immediate action. Several members of Congress have already introduced a resolution calling for Trump to be impeached again, this time specifically for threatening a federal judge and obstructing justice. Now, impeachment of a sitting president for conduct in a criminal case is complicated because there are separation of powers issues, questions about whether Congress should intervene in ongoing legal proceedings. But the argument Democrats are making is that threatening judges isn't just a crime, it's an abuse of presidential power. It's using the office to intimidate the judicial branch, and that's exactly the kind of high crime and misdemeanor that impeachment was designed to address. Whether they can get enough votes to actually impeach is another question, especially with Republicans controlling the Senate. But the fact that it's even being discussed shows how serious this is. Let's break down what this actually means because there are multiple layers here, and they're all critical. First, understand that the independence of the judiciary is one of the foundational principles of American democracy. Judges are supposed to be able to make rulings based on law and evidence, without fear of retaliation from the other branches of government. That's why federal judges have life tenure, so they can't be fired for making unpopular decisions. That's why threatening a judge is such a serious crime, because it undermines the entire system. If judges can be intimidated, if they have to worry that ruling against the president will result in personal consequences, threats, retaliation, then the rule of law collapses. You no longer have an independent judiciary, you have a judiciary that's afraid to check executive power, and that's how democracies die. Second, this incident is going to affect every other legal case Trump is involved in, because judges in those cases are now watching what happened to Judge Hawkins. They're seeing that if they rule against Trump, he might threaten them, he might attack them publicly, he might try to use his presidential power to retaliate, and that creates an impossible situation. Some judges are going to be intimidated, consciously or unconsciously, and they might rule in Trump's favor not because the law demands it, but because they're afraid of what he might do. Other judges are going to bend over backwards to appear fair, to avoid any perception that they're being influenced by Trump's threats, and that might actually work against Trump in some cases. But either way, the integrity of the legal process is compromised. You can't have a fair trial when one of the parties is the President of the United States and is willing to threaten judges who rule against him. Third, this raises enormous questions about Trump's mental state and his ability to control his impulses, because standing up in federal court and threatening a judge is not rational behavior. It's not strategic. It doesn't help your legal case. It makes it catastrophically worse. Any competent attorney would tell their client that the absolute worst thing you can do in court is attack the judge, because judges have enormous power over your case, and antagonizing them is suicidal. But Trump did it anyway, which suggests either he's so disconnected from reality that he doesn't understand the consequences, or he's so consumed by rage and ego that he literally cannot control himself even when his own freedom is on the line. And either one of those possibilities is terrifying when you're talking about someone with access to nuclear weapons and control over the most powerful military on Earth. Fourth, there's an international dimension here that's already causing alarm among America's allies, because foreign governments watch how the United States handles internal crises, and they make judgments about American stability and reliability based on what they see. And what they're seeing right now is the President of the United States threatening judges, being held in contempt of court, potentially facing additional criminal charges, all while he's supposed to be conducting diplomacy and managing relationships with allies and adversaries. European leaders are reportedly expressing private concern about whether Trump is stable enough to be trusted with sensitive negotiations, whether commitments he makes can be relied upon, whether the United States is going to be a reliable partner, or whether it's descending into political chaos. And that erosion of confidence has real consequences for NATO, for trade relationships, or coordinated responses to threats from Russia and China. Fifth, this is going to accelerate conversations about the 25th Amendment that were already happening because of the leaked MRI results. Because even if Trump's cognitive abilities aren't declining, even if he's mentally sharp, threatening judges and losing control in court raises serious questions about his temperament and his fitness to serve. The 25th Amendment isn't just about cognitive impairment. It's about the ability to discharge the powers and duties of the office. And if Trump is making decisions based on rage and impulse, if he's unable to control himself, even when it's obviously against his own interests, then that's arguably an inability to discharge those powers and duties. Cabinet members and the vice president are going to be having very serious conversations about whether this behavior, combined with everything else, rises to the level where they need to consider invoking the amendment. Sixth, there are direct legal consequences that are going to unfold over the next days and weeks. The contempt finding is just the beginning. The Justice Department, even though it's part of the executive branch that Trump controls, is going to be under enormous pressure to investigate whether his threats against Judge Hawkins constitute criminal obstruction or witness intimidation. Now, there's a huge complication here because the DOJ has a policy against indicting sitting presidents, a policy that goes back to the Nixon era. But there's never been a situation quite like this, where a president commits what appears to be a crime in open court, witnessed by dozens of people, with a judicial finding to support it. Some legal scholars are arguing that the policy against indicting sitting presidents shouldn't apply when the president is using his office to obstruct justice and threaten the judiciary, because allowing that to go unpunished essentially puts the president above the law in the most dangerous possible way. And then there's the question of what Judge Hawkins does next, because she has options. She could refer Trump's conduct to the D.C. bar for potential disciplinary action. Although Trump isn't an attorney, so that's not directly applicable. She could refer the matter to federal prosecutors and recommend charges. She could impose additional sanctions if Trump continues to act out in court. She could even potentially order Trump to be excluded from future hearings if his presence is too disruptive, forcing him to participate remotely or through his attorneys. And each of those steps would be unprecedented. Each would create its own constitutional questions and political firestorm, but each is legally within her power as the judge presiding over the case. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because this situation is evolving rapidly, and there are multiple possible trajectories. The immediate focus is going to be on whether Trump continues to escalate, because his pattern historically is to double down when he's challenged, to attack harder, to try to overwhelm his critics with aggression. And if he does that here, if he goes on social media or holds a press conference and attacks Judge Hawkins again, calls for her to be removed, tries to rally his base against her, then the legal jeopardy he's facing multiplies exponentially. Every additional threat, every additional attack, is more evidence of obstruction, more evidence of a pattern of trying to intimidate the judiciary. At the same time, there's going to be intense pressure on Trump's legal team to get him under control. And frankly, that's going to be nearly impossible, because Trump doesn't listen to his lawyers. He doesn't follow their advice. He thinks he knows better than everyone around him. You're probably going to see some of his attorneys resign, either because they're embarrassed to be associated with this behavior, or because they realize they can't effectively represent a client who actively sabotages his own defense. And that's going to create further chaos because Trump has already burned through multiple legal teams, and finding competent attorneys who are willing to represent him is getting harder and harder. Congress is going to have to decide how to respond. The impeachment resolution that Democrats have introduced is going to force a vote, and Republicans are going to have to go on record about whether threatening federal judges is impeachable conduct. Some Republicans might actually vote for it, especially those in swing districts who are already worried about 2026, who see defending this as political suicide. But the MAGA loyalists are going to vote no, and they're going to argue that this is all a setup, that the judge provoked Trump, that he's being unfairly persecuted, and that divide is going to deepen the civil war inside the Republican Party. You're also going to see a lot of legal commentary and analysis from constitutional scholars, former prosecutors, retired judges, all weighing in on what this means and what should happen next. And the consensus is probably going to be that Trump's behavior is disqualifying, that someone who threatens judges cannot be trusted with presidential power, that this is exactly the kind of abuse of office that the founders feared and tried to create safeguards against. But whether that consensus translates into actual accountability, whether institutions actually follow through and hold Trump responsible, that's a different question. And then there's the public reaction, which is going to be deeply divided along partisan lines. Trump's base is going to see this as further proof that the system is rigged against him, that the judges are corrupt, that he's fighting against overwhelming odds to save the country. They're going to rally around him. They're going to donate money to his legal defense fund. They're going to show up at rallies and chant his name. But the majority of Americans, including a lot of people who voted for him, are going to see someone who's out of control, someone who's unfit for office, someone who's making the country less safe and less stable. And that perception gap is going to widen, creating an even more polarized and fractured political environment. There's also a real possibility that this triggers a crisis in the courts themselves. Because if Trump continues to attack Judge Hawkins, if he tries to use his presidential power to retaliate against her, other federal judges are going to have to decide how to respond. You could see judges issuing public statements defending judicial independence. You could see the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court weighing in. You could see a confrontation between the executive and judicial branches that hasn't happened since the Roosevelt court-packing fight, or even the Marbury v. Madison era. And that kind of institutional conflict is dangerous because it erodes public faith in both branches. It creates confusion about who has authority, and it opens the door for Trump to argue that he doesn't have to follow court orders because the courts are illegitimate. So here's the bottom line. Trump losing control in court, threatening a federal judge, being held in contempt. This isn't just a bad news cycle. This is a constitutional crisis in the making. It's a direct assault on the independence of the judiciary. It's evidence of either severe mental instability or authoritarian impulses or both, and it raises fundamental questions about whether the institutions of American democracy can hold against a president who refuses to accept any limits on his power. This is going to dominate the news for weeks. It's going to affect every other legal case Trump is involved in. It's going to reshape the political landscape heading into 2026, and it's going to force Americans to confront whether they're willing to tolerate a president who threatens judges and tries to bully his way out of legal accountability. The way this plays out, the way institutions respond, the way the American people process what just happened, is going to define this era of American politics. Keep your eyes on whether Trump continues to escalate. Keep your eyes on what Judge Hawkins does next. Keep your eyes on whether any Republicans find the courage to say this is unacceptable. And keep your eyes on whether the Justice Department follows through with investigating this as potential criminal conduct. Because this story is far from over, and where it goes from here could determine whether the rule of law survives the Trump presidency.